I'm just about to publish my third, well, it's done. I finished publishing my third book, which is a book of short stories. And today I was going to read one of the short stories, but Ken, I'm sorry, I'm going to depart from this a little bit because the reason he said, okay, 10 minutes. And I looked at my title story of the anthology, which is called the Mad Kyoto Shoe-swapper. And I abridged it to death. And I thought, that's not really very fair to you guys to read that horribly chopped up story. So what I'm going to do is tell you the story of the Mad Kyoto Shoe-swapper.
Hey!
This story came to me from a personal experience. I was in Shinyo-do, which was a temple that I used to live very close to, and I took some friends up there to Shinyo-do, and we went inside, we looked around, and we came out, my shoes were gone. And I was like, okay, now what do I do? But there were a pair of shoes there that were very similar to mine. I said to the priest, here's my address. If somebody gets in touch with you, tell him I wore his shoes home and we can exchange them later. So that's exactly what happened. It was an old, confused guy who, I guess, his wife got home and said, hey, those aren't your shoes. And he was like, you're right, they're not. So anyway, I got my shoes back eventually. But I got the idea of an otaku, a reclusive man, who goes around swapping shoes at temples as a kind of a twisted, fun thing to do. He started his hobby by accident, the same as I did. Absent-mindedly put on the wrong pair of shoes when he left a temple. And as he was walking down the path, he heard a commotion behind him, and he looked around to see this foreigner sort of shouting at the priest in charge. Obviously, he was complaining that his shoes were missing. So this poor little guy went back and sort of went, sorry, I made a mistake. And the foreigner kind of, anyway, you know what foreigners are like. Anyway, this poor guy kind of had nightmares about it for a few days, but then he started to think, what an amazing dramatic opportunity. What if I were to just swap the shoes and then just watch to see what would happen? So the first few times he swapped the shoes, he just went to, one of the 1,000 or so temples and shrines, many of which have very ad hoc arrangements with shoes, as you know. You just leave your shoes at the entrance, go and do the thing, and then you come back and put your shoes on and go away. So he would, the first few times he did that. He just swapped the shoes and kind of peeked around the corner to see what would happen. And of course he had some very entertaining moments watching these people going crazy because their shoes were gone. And he never returned the shoes again because the dramatic, the drama was just too thrilling to interrupt. So he just walked away. But then he started to realize how interesting it was to feel the strangeness of the shoes on his feet. Japanese people are very, very conscious of their feet because they're always changing their shoes and taking their shoes off and putting them on. And this little guy started to feel like, okay, these are not my shoes, and this is how they're different. These are the places where they, rub against my foot. And he would walk around. Everyone knows how wonderful it is to walk in Kyoto. So he would walk and gradually the shoes would meld themselves to his feet until they were like pretty unnoticeable. They started to fit better and better, and finally they fit perfectly, and he didn't notice them anymore. That was the time when he thought, I need to do this again, to feel the same thing. So he had 3 years of doing this shoe swapping all over Kyoto. Every 2 or 3 weeks he had various rules that he would abide by. And he was never caught until one day when he was in a temple that had a rather dark entryway. and he knew which shoes he was going to swap with. He only had one pair of shoes, which was his latest swap. He didn't have any other shoes. So every time he would swap them, every time he had this one pair of shoes. So he was about to swap these horrible, familiar shoes for these other wonderful shoes when he felt a hand come down on his shoulder, and a guy behind him saying, "Excuse me, I think you made a mistake. Those are my shoes." And he's like, he's a very, very reclusive, very lonely guy. He designs websites for a living in his home. He never goes out. He doesn't have any friends. The only thing that he loves is old movies. And his favorite old movie is Casablanca. For some reason. I don't know why. I don't particularly like it myself. But anyway, he has this, every time he has this little ritual. Every time he comes into his apartment in the nighttime, he has this picture of Bogey and Bergman, in a clinch. And he's like, of all the gin mills in all the cities in all the world, he says to this picture every day when he comes home, in Japanese. He doesn't speak English. Anyway, this person behind him who is very kind of a flamboyant sort of leather jacket, cashmere sweater type of guy, he's like, oh, no problem, and he just walks off with his own shoes, and this poor guy has to put on these same shoes that he's been wearing for, several weeks, and they're just so awful. It feels so repulsive to him that he's just, he barely makes it home. And then late at night, he's like, these are the only shoes I have, how am I gonna get to the next swap wearing these disgusting shoes that I hate so much? So he takes a knife and he makes marks inside the shoes to make them uncomfortable enough that he can wear them to the next destination. So as he's doing this, he's looking at himself and thinking, Jesus Christ, what's wrong with me? I can't imagine where this is going. I'm spiraling down to a place I just cannot imagine. Anyway, early in the morning, he can't stay in the house anymore, so he puts on these awful shoes, and he's walking around aimlessly. He finds himself at Kiyomizu. And there's this big, giant gate, wider than this room, and there's a postern, as usual, in the gate. There's a smaller door. And that door is very, very slightly open, so he thinks, okay, I'm going to go in here. So he goes inside, and at this point it kind of departs from reality. You must imagine that the balcony at Kiyomizu is a place where you can actually wear your shoes to walk up to the balcony, which you can't actually do. You're supposed to take your shoes off and then go on the balcony. But in my story, you walk onto the balcony with your shoes on. So he's walking, he finds himself on the balcony, and it's foggy, it's early in the morning, and he sees a pair of black shoes lined up with the toes pointed toward the drop. And he thinks to himself, someone's committed suicide, because that's what Japanese people do before they commit suicide, they take their shoes off. And these shoes were perfect for the swap, but he said, do I really want to swap shoes with a suicide hit? And he can't bear to, look over the railing and see the, body. So he's like, but there's no choice, I have to do it, I can't wear these shoes a moment longer, they're so horrible. So as he's just managing to get out in order to swap for these suicide shoes, he hears a voice behind him, and it's the same guy. It's the film director type from yesterday, with the black leather jacket and the cashmere sweater. And he's like, what are you doing here? And he says the exact same phrase, of all the gin mills in all the cities in all the world. And this kid is like, what? And he says, he can hardly talk to strangers. He's that reclusive. He really can hardly get the words out, but it's like, suicide, you need to tell somebody killed themselves. And the guy looks down and says, oh, don't be silly. Those are my shoes. I left them here yesterday. I must have forgotten them. I'm a film director, and we're making a film here. And the little kid kind of manages to get the word Casablanca out of his mouth. And the guy says, oh, yeah, that's my favorite movie. Here's looking at you, kid. He kind of boppy sort of guy. And he says, geez, you look kind of cold. Would you like to come in my office and get a cup of coffee? And the little guy, well, sure, I guess so. And then he looks down at the guy's shoes, which are completely ruined with the knife. And he looks at his shoes, which of course have been out all night and are completely wet. And he says, well, what are you going to do? You can't wear those, and you can't wear these. What are you going to do? So the kid says, he takes his socks off and sticks them in his pocket. He says, that's okay, I don't need shoes. And the guy says, well, all right, come on, let's go. So this kid is free of his obsession, and he walks away with bare feet to the next stage of his life. That's the end of the story. I think that was better than me reading this horrible abridged version of Breakneck Speed. So anyway, thank you very much.